Hello, good afternoon. How are y'all doing? All right, we're all right. Happy Saturday. Well, welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Sydney. I'm a bookseller here, and we're now hosting in-person and virtual events, along with partnered events, trips, and classes. For a full list of everything confirmed, you can go to our website, which is politics-prose.com. And before we get started today, a few housekeeping items. I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. And while we've listed the mask mandate here in the store, you are encouraged to wear a mask throughout the event, and we can provide one for you if you didn't bring one. And so when we open up the floor to questions, please line up at the standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right so that everyone can hear your question. We are both audio and video recording today's program so that you or anyone you know can find it at the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing up here at this table. So if you've not already purchased the book, we have so many copies behind our registers at the front of the store. We will ask you to line up starting here at the pillar, and then we'll come by to ask your name for personalization. So please have your books ready for us. Because we do have additional events today, we ask that you leave your chairs where they are. And so, without further ado, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Christian Gregory, celebrating the release of The Essential Dick Gregory. So Richard Dick Claxton Gregory was an African-American comedian, civil rights activist, and cultural icon who first performed in public in the 1950s. He is on Comedy Central's list of 100 greatest stand-ups and was the author of 16 books. While an entertainer, he was more known for being outspoken about social change and starting a health clean eating campaign. The Essential Dick Gregory is a carefully curated anthology of previously unavailable transcripts and excerpts taken from Dick Gregory's books, albums, audio compilations, and more than 1,200 hours of archival video, including lectures, interviews, and comedic performances. At its core, it's a celebration of Dick Gregory's wisdom and vision as an artist, performer, and dedicated activist. Christian Gregory is the 8th child of Dick and Lillian Gregory. In addition to caring for DC natives and prominent political figures as a chiropractor, Dr. Gregory worked as his father's manager. Together, they formed Dick Gregory Media, Inc. in 2015. Dr. Gregory's unique combined experiences in patient care and entertainment management fostered the desire to develop linkages between activism, communication, the performing arts, and physical well-being. To that end, he established Tower Hill Farm Health and Wellness and Tower Hill Farm Entertainment. Since his passing in 2017, Dr. Gregory has managed his father's estate and intellectual property and has successfully guided the development of other projects on his father's life. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Dr. Christian Gregory.
Sydney, thank you for that very kind and gracious introduction. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming out and joining me on what feels like a homecoming. Sydney mentioned my practice, but my practice was literally almost walking distance from here, about less than a mile up the street at Connecticut and Van Ness. So Politics and Prose has a very unique place in my heart, in my family's heart. It was always like the town square for us. So my dad would come here regularly. Some of you may have heard this before, but my dad would always say as he was out lecturing, and he meant it with love and kindness, if you want to hide something from an ignorant person, put it in a book. And so as I look around and see all of these hiding spaces around us here, I have to think my dad has left some things here at some point in all of his visits here. So if you find any Easter eggs, do let me know. So the truth of the matter is, I say this often, no country for old legends. My dad, for 60 of his 84 years of life, was really just out there on the front line serving. Yes, first civil rights movement, but then just really laser focused on serving humanity. So a lot of that led to his activism, led to, and it was always rooted in comedy. That the comedy was always a cornerstone. But as he evolved into kind of health, diet, wellness, spirituality, when we first came up with the concept, so after my dad's transition in 2017, we were working on defining moments in Black history. My dad passed away about a month before we released this book. The unique thing about this book is it's reflective. It's my dad at 84 years of age looking back over his life. And as one of the reviewers said, you have an opportunity in hindsight to kind of soften some of the rough edges of those times. The difference in defining moments in the Essential Dick Gregory is we divided this book up into body, mind, and spirit, and we were able to go back and find transcripts and recordings from my dad in the actual time period. So it's not Dick Gregory speaking back, reflecting on the assassination of Dr. King. It's what he actually said that night while he spoke at a college, moments after, hours after the assassination of Dr. King. So the unique thing about this book, because my dad had 16 books, this would be a 17th, and oftentimes it was asked, does there really need to be another book? And the answer is yes, because it's not a book that he's thinking back on things. It really, almost like a time capsule, takes you back to those some pretty profound moments in American history. The estate is working on a multitude. So most of these books have evolved and have been turned into some type of audiovisual project. So there's shorts, there's movies, there's documentaries, there's biopic that we're currently working on. The beauty of there being so many books, it gives us so much intellectual property to develop into different things. So the collection, as we're calling this here, in really more than editing it, my job was to kind of hunt and gather, because there was reducing all that we had into the 80,000 or so words that were permitted for this book was very challenging. It was probably one of the most challenging things that we've done. I say we because it was a whole team. It was my wife, Melissa, and she can attest to the fact we had stacks all over our home of just, documents from civil rights rallies, lectures he had given, speeches he had given, and to choose what made the cut and what didn't was profoundly challenging. And so when we finally boiled it down to what we felt very, just incredibly good about, and also, my dad was always particular how he did his books. He would always call it, he was emptying out his mind into a recording device, and then he'd work with a team of collaborators to frame the book. But he was always particular about someone else not making it or editing in a way that it does not represent his message or the man. So it was very, in a very spiritual, not kind of, especially this close to Halloween, not, voices at night, but very clear hearing my dad communicate with me about how he wanted this to be presented. And so the very talented Charlie Palmer is the artist that drew the cover art, what we're calling the Dick Gregory Mount Rushmore, and just beautifully captured the body, the mind, and the spirit. The body goes from my father's birth in 1932 to 1970. And during that time, it was his, and I'm sorry, 61, from 1932 to 1961. And we went with body for that because that's when he was really using his body to put food on the table. So he was in the Army during that time. He was just an incredible cross-country runner. He had broke many records, including the 1 mile in St. Louis in high school. And when he realized that they didn't keep records for black athletes and they didn't get listed in the paper, that was his first form of activism. He was outraged, and so he had stormed down to City Hall and to the education department to insist that that policy changes. It just so happened and aligned, and that's why I frequently say my dad was an accidental activist, and I don't say that to take anything away from his activism. The universe was clearly watching out for him. It aligned perfectly with a civil rights rally that was happening, with an NAACP rally. And so as they converged on Town Hall, my father always being, even at a young age, very colorful and sometimes animated, he became the star of the rally. So although he was there to protest something very different than what the masses were there, which they were upset about overcrowding in black schools. And so he was able to get a taste of what activism felt like, and he really, really, really enjoyed it. He really enjoyed how he felt. And so the two things, well, really the three things, it was running, then it was comedy, and then it was activism that early on in his life had come together. And as time went on, he really went out of his way to find a way to make them all kind of congeal and mesh together. 1962, he's already a breakout comedian. He's one of the highest paid entertainers, black or white, in America. And that's when we transition over to the mind section. He was using his intellect, he was using his wit and his wisdom to provide for his family, but also to provide for his people being humanity, for lifting folks up. Here's a man born in 1932, Jim Crow segregated St. Louis. 1932 was the poorest year of the Great Depression. The times had got so hard in Missouri that they, in St. Louis specifically, coal plants there had started burning softer coal with more sulfur in it that was illegal. It created so much soot that for 7 days, young 7-year-old Dick Gregory didn't see the sun. It was just black for 7 days. And a lot of that was a catalyst for what later became his activism as an environmentalist. So many things we read about and then we decide we want to get involved with it, but he experienced it. These were things that he saw kind of the worst of. We already know, we hear people now talk a lot about the racism that's in fuel and energy and toxic pollutants and where plants are located and where we store waste and contaminants, many times being in areas where people are socioeconomically marginalized. Well, that was his reality. That was his reality from birth. He also, pretty much in the body section, we deal with the fact that, all of the insecurities that we understand today were his norm. My dad frequently said that he had a relationship with hunger. Hunger was his friend. When hunger was not present, he was not that comfortable. And part of that would help us understand why someone would sacrifice their body so much and basically not fasting for medicinal reasons, but starving himself to bring attention to causes. Although it was obviously hard, and this isn't to diminish what he was doing, but in his mind, he actually felt comforted by that extreme starvation. That was something that took him back to his childhood, took him back to his mother's love. And he explains, and we touch on that, he touches on that in the first section of this book, how his mother had an ability, just a loving, beautiful woman who had the ability to, just through tactile stimulation, lay hands on his stomach, and he would feel nourished and sustained by that to the point that his hunger pains would go away. And a lot of that, what he would call, loving and lovable, was rooted in that, when we say people who are food insecure, well, and this isn't to, again, take away from that. That's not starve. That's, I don't know where my next meal may be coming from. He was beyond insecure. His roof didn't have his home didn't have a roof on it. Most of his youth, he was barefoot. We live in a time now with so much excess, and that's a beautiful thing, that we can't always fully realize just how difficult life was for everyone during the Great Depression, specifically for African Americans. So we touch on that, and we're laser focused not to revisit material that's in other books. So most of what you'll find in here, you will not find in any of the other 16 books. And so we jump forward to the mind, and where he's just using his beautiful mind, the combination of, I frequently say, pressure and heat on coal makes diamonds. Part of the hardness of his life that I should point out now, that none of us 10 Gregory kids can even begin to relate, because he was able to change the DNA in his lifetime and what our reality was. So I look back at this and I have a hard time even fathoming the challenges in the struggle. He frequently talks about the struggle as a civil rights movement, but the struggle for him was really just life. And so in this section here, we talk about his run for president in 1968. And the wonderful thing about 17 books, I have plenty of props. So, and I see Joshua here. This book was compliments of you, so thank you, sir. The 1968, my dad ran for president with Mark Lane as a write-in candidate. And he was, this was before a time when so many people now run for president because it has become, running for president has become an industry that now people use as a way to radio shows, television shows, and to write books. So this was really kind of forward-leaning and ahead of its time. I don't know if this book is carried here, but I encourage most people now, especially in this political time that we're in, to pick up Write Me In. I guess, as my wife knows, I like to give break news when I'm in DC. So the film that we're doing based on my dad's life is based on the through line in that film is based on the 1968 presidential run, because 1968, as many of you know, was almost like a second Civil War. There was a lot that was going on. I mean, in my dad's lifetime, 6 people he knew personally were struck down, assassinated by assassins' bullets. And so this isn't just random violence on the street. This was very purposeful, targeted killings. And so, and as many of you know, he was also on that list. He was on J. Edgar Hoover's list of people to be, quote unquote, neutralized. And so when you now look at people who are talking about the FBI and are talking about surveillance, or all these things hit different. They land a little different for us, Gregory's, because we know as tax-paying citizens that part of the machinery of this country was targeted to take our dad out. And not to be selfish of the 10 children, but that hit was well before 1970 when I was born. So had it been through, not that I'm here to change the world, but it lands a little more when you know that someone was trying to, assassinate your father, and it wasn't just some random entity. It was with the federal government's blessing. So we talk about that in the movie in a very kind of powerful and strong way. I don't want to give too much of the laser focus that's through it, but it's basically the run layered over a biopic, his life story, and it's really powerfully done. It's a very dynamic team, and I want to take a moment just to address the team and how so much of the team kind of connects back here to not just Washington, D.C., but to politics and prose, specifically this location. My clinic, as I mentioned, was just a mile up the street. This was June 2017. My dad leaves to come down and pick up some books here, walks into politics and prose, and Kevin Hart's here. He's having a book signing for his new book, and so Kevin sees my dad and jumps up on the table and screams. And so the two of them immediately, book signing over for a moment. The two of them step aside, and they really have a powerful moment. And I want to get back to what that moment was rooted in. But Kevin, inside his book, says, "To Mr. Gregory, a.k.a. Mr. Legend, 2017, thank you for the knowledge." And so the knowledge that Kevin is speaking of isn't just the knowledge that we all collectively know that Dick Gregory liked to share and give. 2016, December, right here at my practice, Nick Cannon was shooting in my lobby, in my waiting room, was shooting the opening for his new Showtime comedy special. So as some of my patients may know, my practice kind of doubled as a soundstage at times. So Nick Cannon, Showtime team's in there, and as they're wrapping up, the young lady who runs my front office, her son, who had been dealing with some medical issue, was at Children's National. And whether it's true or not, she felt like she was, and when you're in a hospital, you always feel like you're not getting everyone's full attention. So for whatever reason, and I happen to feel very strongly about Children's National Hospital, and have a wonderful relationship with them, she felt as though they were not getting the care she would have liked to have received. And I said, oh, well, okay, well, Dick and Nick are sitting here in the lobby right now. There's no better way to get folks' attention than a Dick and Nick visit. So we quickly packed up the vehicles, shot over to Children's Hospital. The place was just electrified. It was 4 days before Christmas, so we were visiting all the rooms, visiting all the children. It just was a very special Christmas. We did not know that that would be my dad's last Christmas. We did not know that that was 2016 was his last Christmas. We spent probably close to 2 hours, I would say, at Children's Hospital. Afterwards, Nick Cannon had been complaining about some shoulder pain the whole time. The only reason it wasn't addressed is because we were on such a tight schedule, and he was 2 hours past due from when he was supposed to be wheels up from Dulles Airport. So they keep calling to hold his plane, and so there was a lot of moving parts. Wake up the next morning, turn on the news, and see Nick Cannon had been rushed to the hospital the moment he had landed in LA. Quickly called Nick to say, hey, and there's a very powerful point to this story that I want to get to say, hey, what's going on, man? We just saw you. I saw on the news. And he quickly called back and said, that shoulder pain I was feeling wound up to be a lot more complicated than just shoulder pain. It was a pulmonary embolism that was triggered from his lupus. And so I'm speaking of this because he's already spoken on it. I'm not violating HIPAA here. He already spoke on this publicly. And so he said, I'm going to be in the hospital for the next 4 days. I'll be spending Christmas here. So my dad and I said, well, you know what? In Christmas for my dad and I was normally very, we fasted, we meditated, we were completely off the grid for it. I said, why don't we shoot out to LA and, sit with Nick in his hospital room? So we decided to do that. We quickly got out. It was Christmas Day. We arrived in LA. As we're walking into we were in the ICU region, which typically they don't allow a whole lot of folks in. There was about a good 10 of us back in the room. As we're walking in, Kevin Hart's walking in, and this was before Kevin was here, and it was like a family reunion. But my dad at that point in life, he could be very tough love, and so he really started laying into Kevin about the system, meaning the entertainment system, can chew you up and spit you out. And if you're not careful, if you're not laser focused, if you don't watch who you surround yourself with, if you're not very particular about who's your team and watching not just your money, but your brand. I mean, Dick Gregory was one of the first brands that was out here and understood that logic. And so Kevin in the One and Only Dick Gregory, which is a documentary on Showtime, Kevin Hart very colorfully explains how, well, Dick Gregory was just cussing me out for hours. And I was there. He literally was. But it was done with so much love that even Kevin himself was like, I said, Dick, slow down. I'm not challenging. I just never heard this before. And, the aggression in which you're telling it to me is blocking me from getting the message. And a lot of that aggression was just those 83 years at that time in feeling a sense like, hey, this clock is running out. I really want to pass the baton, not just to one person. I've never put that pressure on Kevin Hart, but I want to pass the baton, and I want to make sure that all of the work that we did in the civil rights movement, there were a lot of black entertainers and white entertainers that were active in the civil rights movement. We want to make sure that work does not get lost or squandered or forgotten. That message resonated so deeply with Kevin Hart. In 2019, Kevin was in a car accident and almost literally, if not severed his spine, damaged his spine to the point they were not certain if he would walk or not again. And during that time, as he reflected back to me, he just heard that, aggressive Dick Gregory in his head. You could walk out of here today. You could be hit by a trash truck. A year from now, no one would know your name. And I was there when he was telling Kevin all of that. And so Kevin decided in that moment, maybe it was about 3 months later when he was rehabbing and recovering nicely, when he reached out and pointed out, he said, look, anything that the estate of Dick Gregory is doing, I want to be involved with. I want to come on board as an executive producer, help things to be financed, help things to be greenlit. So everyone I talk to now that's like, how are you doing such incredible work with your father's estate? The One and Only Dick Gregory on Showtime was nominated for an Emmy Award. The Right to Offend, which is on A&E Network, Part 1, Part 2. If you haven't seen it yet, it really is a must-watch. Part 1 is almost like a Dick Gregory documentary, and there's rumors about Emmy nods for that as well. And the biopic that we're currently working on is with Heartbeat, Kevin Hart, Sony. So out of that moment in that hospital room that had all of the, I frequently say, you never know how far-reaching something you do or say today will be tomorrow. I frequently remind people of that. That moment, which later followed up with this moment, the knowledge that Kevin Hart was talking about when he wrote in this book was the knowledge that Dick Gregory imparted on him in that room, which was literally, again, my dad's last Christmas, and my dad passed away 2 months after Kevin wrote this to him. And so it's all bigger than us, and I'm very clear on that. One of 10 children. I frequently say, there's 7 girls, 2 boys, and 1 man in the Gregory family. I won't say that now because my siblings are not here to defend themselves, but it's a big, large, loving family, and all of us together are really protecting our father's body of work. And we also, my dad's first book was From the Back of the Bus. It was a book that he wrote. Hugh Hefner had wrote the foreword in that. That's when my dad, as many of you know, Hugh Hefner was the platform at the Playboy Club, not the mansion. I'm careful to point out. At the Playboy Club in Chicago was where my dad got his start. That was the first opportunity he had to perform to the world stage, and the rest was kind of history. So after From the Back of the Bus, in 1962, my dad released his autobiography with a very colorful title that I won't repeat. But after his autobiography was released, then it was shortly after that the civil rights movement really called, and my dad stopped entertaining. So he started writing books as a way to supplement his income that he was now losing from not being an active comedian, an active entertainer. And in the books that he left us, in all of the albums, it has about 12 studio albums, is really where we're getting all of the seeds. And like I tell people all the time, my job has just been to water the seeds, pull the weeds. There's not a whole lot of intellectual capacity that I have to put into all these things, because sadly, these are not historic. They're still topical. A lot of the issues my dad was dealing with in the 60s and 70s are still things. To not point out the progress while acknowledging that would be a disservice. And my dad always went overboard to point out how far we have come. We as collectively, as humanity, but still have work to do. And part of that still have work to do is in this book. So the autobiography with the colorful title, intentionally colorful title, was really kind of a love letter to his mother. It really spoke to just the Lucille Gregory, just the blessing that she was to him and the Gregory children. The Essential Dick Gregory is really a love letter to our mother, Lillian Gregory. It's simply dedicated to Lil. And any of you, and I bumped into a few of you that have had Dick Gregory stories who've met my dad personally, in my dad's entire career, no matter where it was in his career, in order to reach him, it was always call Lil. If you needed to, that was the only. My dad never had bodyguards, although due to my size and my brother Gregory's size, frequently thought Dick Gregory was traveling with bodyguards, but it was his 2 sons that didn't have any interest in protection at the moment. I assure you, we were off doing whatever else kids at that age were typically doing. But it was always call Lil. His number was phone numbers were always listed. Our address was always public, and so it led to a lot of colorful moments at the farm in Massachusetts of people just presenting. But my dad, if the FBI couldn't get to him, he wasn't really too concerned about anyone else. And so he firmly believed that the universal God was shining down on him and watching over him. And that was all the protection he ever needed. And he felt to reach out for anything more than that was almost a disservice. As he would always say, fear and God can't occupy the same space. So we managed to get all of that into the last section of the book, which is the spirit. It speaks to Dick Gregory's spiritual journey, the long gray beard when he was a voice for, so many generations because he had been there. My dad spoke at so many colleges and universities. One of and I laugh at some of this, my dad had given the commencement address at Harvard University, and I don't have the exact year. It was in the 60s. Back there, the N-word was a little different. When we pulled the transcript, the N-word was used so many times that we wound up not being able to put that into this book in 2022. But this was at Harvard, and so it speaks to how, words have meanings, and the meaning that the words have for what we give them. And my dad's, for his lifetime, was to defang that word, to not allow that word to have so much venom, so much power, not to diminish its painful history, but to moving forward, not to allow that word to have the impact on other folks that it had on him. So when we 2019, my dad's book, The N Word, we re-released it on Audible as an audiobook. And here, my dad named the book that to make people uncomfortable. The white people had called him that. He wanted to make them as uncomfortable as the word made him. I'm sitting and getting ready to go on stage at Amazon, Audible's headquarters in New Jersey. And remember, one of the lawyers from Audible came in and presented me with a document. I just thought it was a release because they were videotaping it. And it was basically saying, you can hold your dad's book up, the autobiography, but you cannot say the word. And for me, why I smiled at that and was happy to sign it, because that's not the issue for me that it was back in 1962 when he named the book that. It showed that if a company as big as Amazon Audible in 2019 is still so uncomfortable by this title, I have to sign a legal agreement not to say it. Pop, you were ahead of your time. You're still making people uncomfortable with how you titled things, and I don't think you could get much more uncomfortable than that. We thought about, when we over 1 million copies of that book have been sold. It's in textbooks all across America. McGraw-Hill. And how they get around the title is they just pull long excerpts from the book. So there's an excerpt called Shame that has been in McGraw-Hill since we were children in school. So it's odd when you're studying your own father in high school and college, and then they have the audacity to give you a bad grade on it. You say, wait a minute. Well, would you like me to invite the man in to explain why you are wrong? So so it is. Some of us clearly didn't read the book. So with all of that to say, there's so many blessings. I mean, if the life cycle does what it's supposed to do, all children will lose their parents at some point. It's not supposed to be the other way around. Sadly, that happens too frequently. And for me, especially, again, not just being the son of, but being my dad's business partner, being one of his healthcare providers, I had known his health had been failing for quite some time. I say no country for old legends because from Stevie Wonder, Cicely Tyson, a lot of these just megastars, I had the same relationship with them that I did with my dad, as just kind of being their body person, their fixer. And sometimes it would sadden you a little bit to see folks approach and not understand that legends get old. They're not the same person they were, and they're like all of us in our 40s and 50s. And to expect the same from them, it'd be like going to see a 90-year-old Michael Jordan and being upset because he can't dunk. If he can still dribble the ball, that's amazing. And so we need to calibrate our expectations, and time changes us. And part of the reason we didn't use anything new or current in here was because we wanted people to feel the energy, the fire in the belly that a young Dick Gregory that was appropriate for the sections of the book we were discussing was mentioning. And for me, as a loving son, to be 30,000 feet up looking down on all of this, it's just amazing to hear someone to have said the whole thing throughout their lifetime. Different ways, naturally. Language would change a little bit. Energy would change a little bit. I frequently say it's a fine line between anger and passion. A lot of times his passion would be confused with anger. We were here so much about our world is here in this D.C. area. The week my dad transitioned, we were at Sibley Hospital just up the road here, and it was at the time that we were still talking about in 2017. That was Charlottesville. There was a lot of racial tension and racial ugliness that was going on in the world. And my dad, who was, not, we're in the hospital. He's not doing well. We're watching CNN, and we saw something about Charlottesville, and then there was an alt-right rally that was taking place in Boston, which is our home. And I remember he woke up and said this and then went right back to sleep. He looked at the TV, and if you recall, during Charlottesville, there were 3 people that lost their life. It was the young lady who tragically lost her life when she was ran over in the crowd. But there were 2 Virginia State police officers whose helicopter had gone down as they were responding to the rally and the fight emanating from the rally. And my dad explained, as he was, acknowledging all of those losses of life, The difference that would have been in the 60s, those police officers in that helicopter would have been coming to shore up the line and be a part of the attack against them, not coming to help them. And it was profoundly important because we can get caught up in the moment of the day, but not take the time to really acknowledge the profound progress that has been made. So this book really kind of toes the line while acknowledging the profound progress, but also acknowledging the work that still needs to be done. So, as I said, sadly, the book is not historical, it's still topical, but it really is, it's a tool to kind of show us there is a way forward. And anyone that really knew Dick Gregory knew the man was full of joy, full of love, full of happiness. That ICU room that he passed away in, there was entirely too much laughter coming out of that room, and that's the way he would have wanted it. I mean, he winked to acknowledge he was crystal clear on all that was happening. And what really hit me at that moment was, here's a man that was supposed to be by Medgar Evers' side when Medgar Evers was assassinated, had just seen Dr. King 2 days before Dr. King was assassinated. He talked to JFK and RFK regularly. A lot of people didn't know that. It wasn't until we started researching a lot of these projects and looking at a lot of the Freedom of Information sign-in logs, just how frequently Dick Gregory was down in D.C. meeting with RFK and trying to shape civil rights legislation. And all of those folks in his orbit to be, assassinated at their prime due to hatred. And we have the 3 M's in here: Medgar, Martin, and Malcolm, which were all people who were just incredibly close to my dad. All of their children became like his children. And so a lot of times people call my dad Baba. He was a father of a movement. All those, children who had lost their parents to the movement, and not just the big name ones, he took care of them. He paid it, and again, this wasn't something till we found out till after his transition, just how many people he paid their college tuition for, the amount of doctors and lawyers. He had a relationship with Howard University. If there were any students in their medical school, law school, or dentistry school that were excelling academically, but for financial reasons were the only reason they were not going to graduate, he paid their tuition. And many times they didn't even know it. It wasn't until later, through their own research, they found out. So, it's us Gregory children, when people frequently say, how did it feel to, grow up and your dad not be in the home? And his response when he was asked that, he would always say, well, Hitler had a mother and father at home. Jack the Ripper had a mother and father at home. Sometimes we place too much value on both mom and dad being there. And he made it very clear that, and I'll make it very clear, even when he wasn't physically there, his presence was always felt. And for 6 months of my life, and I have part of the reason I know how beautiful Iran is, my dad was in a prison cell there for 6 months, and every week he would send these beautiful postcards to all of the Gregory children. So I think my lifetime, I've got more postcards from Iran from anywhere else in the world. And he was there because he was protesting, and although President Jimmy Carter asked him not to go, he insisted on going and trying to be beneficial in getting the hostages released. And so he was the only American to meet with the Shah of Iran. And so in our home in Plymouth, Massachusetts, we had this 6 foot by 6 foot oil painting of the Shah of Iran. People would come over and be like, it's a long story. And so many of these things, as a Gregory, it's a long story to explain why and how certain things got where they're at. But the boots on the ground, almost Forrest Gump-like, there's so many moments in American history that Dick Gregory didn't just happen to be there. He fled to get there in time. And so he was an activist. He described himself as a soldier. His weapon was his mind. He put his body on the line. So much of the nonviolent movement that he just adhered to was rooted in was the strength and peacefulness and love. And when the image of the scene of the tank and the Chinese citizen standing there in front of the tank with the flower, we later realized all that was rooted in America's civil rights movement, Dr. King, and the nonviolence. And when you're matched against powers that supersede your ability, so many times the only way you can fight that is with love is with peace. And in addition to that, and for my dad's lifetime, I would add that he beautifully added comedy to that. He understood that if you can get people laughing with you, you can bring them in. And a lot of times it's in laughter that we open up and realize that the mistake in our ways and that we should rethink things. And, Dick Gregory was a master of what I call boomerang jokes. You thought you got it at the time, but a day or two later, it comes back and it hits you again. You say, oh, wait a minute. I laughed at that, but that's not funny at all. That's pretty impactful. And you really start to feel a little silly about some of the ways you felt about things. So Dick Gregory always described himself as a master teacher. He said to teach, many times you have to agitate folks' mind, but to do it with love, to do it with peace. And he frequently said, and I know we don't have agitators and washing machines anymore, but when we did, if you remove the agitator from the washing machine, you just wind up with dirty, wet drawers. And so on that, I'll simply say, and this is, I must say this, on the back of the book here, this is a photograph from my dad's last show. So this was a show he did in California. Matthew Bitton, who's just a world-renowned, oddly enough, Grammy-nominated photographer because he shot so many photos for album covers, took this picture, and it really captured kind of the ease in which Dick Gregory went through life. At that point in his life, he had switched over, and he was only wearing suits from Lululemon and brands like that he could wash in the washing machine because that was his new thing. I'm getting toxins and environmental pollutants, not just away from me, but away from the environment. So he had moved away from dry cleaning. And so that was maybe a year or so before he passed that he had made. So I say where so many people get set in their ways, he was always, at 84, there's not too much of changes you're making for the environment that are really going to impact you directly. So he was always looking forward to how things were going to impact young folks. And because he walked away from comedy and had committed himself to speaking at colleges and universities, when Coretta Scott King passed away, the service was in Atlanta, and my dad and I attended. It was in a mega church just outside of Atlanta, so my dad was disappointed it was at a mega church, but that's a different story. So we arrived, and every living president was there. At the time, George W. Bush was the sitting president. And as every one of the presidents were brought in, they broke away from their Secret Service detail to give my dad a hug, and each of them whispered in his ear. And when W came by and whispered in his ear, he said, you gave the commencement address when I was at Yale. And so much of that we think of later in life, Dick Gregory, think of him speaking to HBCUs, and we forget that in the 60s and 70s, he was literally the tip of the spear. He was everywhere. And as a result of him moving away from comedy and speaking on college campuses, it really gave him the opportunity to go out and meet and see all of America and all of its shapes, forms, and sizes, and really just double down with the love and gratitude that he had for all of humanity. So as a Gregory, I could easily go on for another 2 hours, but I was given a time limit, which I like, and my wife's been giving me the signal. My dad is a comedian. We'd be in comedy clubs, and they'd hit him with the light, which meant nothing to him. So 2 hours passed. The light became like a strobe light. Then they're like, go get his son, go get his son. I said, I'm not the Sandman. I'm not pulling this man off the stage. I said, he'll be wearing me out the whole ride home. So so when I get lights and signs, I smile, but I do respond to them. So thank you all very much. I truly appreciate all of your time. And you can be anywhere. It's a beautiful day here in D.C. So thank you for taking the time to join us here. So in Politics and Prose, thank you for having me here.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. We do have some time for some questions. If you want to line up, if you want to ask some questions, we ask you that you come up to this microphone. We have about 10, 15 minutes if you want to come up here.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I do, and I have my other one there too. So thank you, Mom.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just
great.
fine.
So thank you very much for coming and speaking to us today. I really do appreciate it. I loved hearing that story about Kevin Hart because actually how I first heard of your father was I was seeing Dave Chappelle in Milwaukee, and he discussed a phone call he had with your father. And I wish I remember what exactly he said, but it was so long ago that I can't quite remember. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about his relationship with Chappelle and maybe more generally with younger entertainers as well.
Great question. Thank you for asking it. As I mentioned, Dick Gregory became like a baba father figure to so many folks. To Dave Chappelle, he really was like a father. My dad knew Dave since Dave was 17 years old. So my dad and Dave would get together and go to lunch in D.C. They just were incredibly close. Dave's parents, who were both college professors, were very close with my dad. So my dad would spend time with Dave in Yellow Springs, Ohio. We'd spend time with Dave in D.C. And it was when Dave had hit bumps in the road as we hit him, and he decided to pull away from his very lucrative deal and go and spend some time away in South Africa. It was a conversation that Dave had with my dad that brought Dave back. So, if I was a selfish son, I'd point out all the joy that Dave's spreading to folks now and say, oh, you can thank Dick Gregory for bringing Dave back and grounding him. And my dad did Richard Pryor, you name the entertainer, young and old. My dad spent just tremendous amount of time with them to help them to understand, to not go through the same pitfalls that he had gone through as an entertainer. Towards the end of my dad's life, he had made it very clear. He gave me, 3 assignments: take care of your mother, take care of your sister, my sister Ayana, and I'll explain that in a moment, and take care of his SHIT, meaning all of his intellectual property. And so the reason he said that about my sister Ayana, is because she's an entertainer. She's a singer, and out of all of the other Gregorys, he knew that from his time as an entertainer, he knew how tough it was, not just to break through, but also to maintain, and just how the system sometimes can kind of eat you up from within. And so Ayana was very helpful on this book. This book is dedicated to my mom, and it's all about his SHIT. So I feel like this book right here shows I'm a listener. So I listened to what he asked me to do, and everything else that we're doing from this point forward really would be rooted in those same kind of pillars. But you name, and you mentioned some names, but also the singer, not Moby, who very big British singer. He did a whole Dick Gregory album that most people have no idea about. His name will come to me in a moment. Begins with M. Morrissey, thank you. So Morrissey did a whole Dick Gregory album. Sorry, Morrissey. Morrissey did a whole Dick Gregory album. New Year's Eve 2016, Morrissey was performing in Los Angeles, and he had invited my dad and I to come to the show. He wanted to dedicate the whole show to my dad, but my dad, in a very colorful way, said, "Who the beep 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 is beep 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 beep?" So that didn't happen. But in fairness to Morrissey, my dad and I were in Minneapolis, and Prince came running up. Prince, huge Dick Gregory fan, more than most people could ever even wrap their mind around. So Prince, in his small, beautiful, graceful self, came up and introduced himself to my dad and did it. And I could see in my dad's eyes, he's great at making you think he knows who you are. And the moment Prince turned and walked away, he got the Morrissey treatment. Who is that little weird beep, 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 beep? And so I said, well, Pop, we'll talk about it later. He's one of the biggest entertainers in the world, as is Morrissey. So Morrissey, Dave Chappelle, all these folks, they perform with huge pictures of Dick Gregory behind them. Many of them didn't have a personal closeness. So Morrissey's story, and I talk about this stuff because it's public, he was suicidal. He watched a Dick Gregory video on YouTube, and that made him decide he wanted to live. And so as a result of that, you almost won't see anything that he puts out where there's not some acknowledgement to that. So for my dad, it was much more, when he saw Kevin Hart here signing books, it was much more than, hey, there's a fellow entertainer. It was a brotherhood and a sisterhood. And I say sisterhood, Aretha Franklin, Cicely Tyson, all of these folks were part of a network of good, and they all did a lot more than what we realized they did. And so yes, to answer your question, I probably don't have enough time here to talk about all the personal relationships. Nick Cannon and my dad were frequently spotted out and about in DC, going out to restaurants and talking. My dad was like was like a grandpa and grandson relationship. So when Nick had decided he was going to walk away from NBC because there was certain language and words he wanted to use, it was my dad that really helped calibrate that. So really, he was a master calibrator because he had seen it all before. Not that he was born with all this wisdom. He took, innate nature versus nurture. And so it allowed him to really, although he's gone, still have a meaningful impact in the works that others that we look up to are doing. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, I was curious if you could share a little bit about the story of how he and Mark Lane connected and his involvement into assassination research and bringing that out to the public.
Great question. That will have us here almost another hour, folks. But I'm going to be quick because I know someone else is speaking here. So Mark Lane, who I mentioned, 1968, write me in. I believe it was the Freedom and Peace ticket or Peace and Freedom ticket. Mark Lane was Dick Gregory's running mate, and they became just incredible friends ever since then. So they realized as they were crisscrossing the country and as they were being tailed by agents everywhere they went, it changes your perspective on things when you're on the other end of it. And so after Dr. King was assassinated, they got together and started really talking about a lot of the similarities in things that were off and kind of the occult things that were lining up to show that a lot of these things emanated from the same dark place. And so my dad and Mark Lane wrote a book together. It was originally called Codename Zorro, which was the FBI's code name for Dr. King. It later was turned to Murder in Memphis. I don't think they wanted to give the FBI any credit in using their term as the title. So it later became Murder in Memphis, and that book is still available. Matter of fact, there's 2 Dr. King I won't call them biopics, but movies that are in the work that I know they're using Murder in Memphis as kind of the foundation of the information they're using with that. So my dad had a great relationship with Mark Lane and later our mutual friend Steve Jaffe, and they went on to do a lot of great work that they don't get credit for. Not that they did it for credit, but they don't get credit for. My dad and Ralph Nader went around the country. 3-point seatbelts, things we take so simple. We're out there every time you get in a car and click it. A lot of that technology that went on to airbags was Dick Gregory and Ralph Nader. They were out there just poking and saying, like, look, we know there's ways. In America today, we lose 40,000 people a year to automobile accidents. And imagine how many more it would be if there wasn't airbags and seatbelts. And these weren't things they ever wrote books about and wanted pats on the back about. It was just their love for humanity. So great question. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, I had 2 questions. One was if you can tell anything a little bit more about his entry into kind of sustainability and the environment and his support for that. And the second one was just curious about his relationship with the Jewish community, both growing up and through the civil rights movement and beyond.
Great, again, 2 great questions. So I'll start, especially in this time that we're in now, I'll start with my dad's relationship with the Jewish community. It was, as we talked about, Steve Jaffe, Mark Lane, so many of the folks, the only reason I'm pausing for a minute is how I frame this. My dad will always be very careful in framing this, is back during the abolitionist movement, black folks weren't allowed to be in the abolitionist movement because the abolitionists felt that, since you were denied education, since you were denied fighting skills and moral skills, you would be more of even though we're fighting for you, you would be more of a liability for us to be here. My dad went out of his way to, and anyone that's ever heard Dick Gregory speak, the love that he has. Matter of fact, every year for his birthday, he would go up to West Virginia to go, and I'm drawing a blank here, to Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, to go to hug the tree that John Brown was hung from. He felt so strongly that here's a man that is not being attacked, and if I don't step in and be an activist for all others and all of humanity, then it's really a disservice. So to the question you asked about Dick Gregory and the Jewish community, part of the reason my dad was so careful about the books he released and always wanting to do the final edit himself, because he realized words matter. And words sometimes matter even more than intent. And so he was always careful and laser focused to say, when my books are released, people don't know it's a team. They know it's me. The reason Dick Gregory never did cartoons and animation, he said, I don't want someone making me say things that I don't potentially believe. So he was so guarded with his information because he wanted to make sure no one ever perverted what he meant to make it seem like it. But yes, my dad was super pro-black, but he wasn't pro-black at a point at other people's detriment. He just felt that he needed to level the playing field. So he didn't find another, he didn't create another enemy to help elevate his platform. And he was always very important. It was always very important to him to be inclusive and a First Amendment warrior for certain, but realize even with that, it has its limitations when your words are creating real harm. And I think we're seeing that, or I know we're dealing with that right now. And so for my dad, we grew up in a home that isms and osms didn't matter. I mean, we grew up, definitely since my dad grew up with a Christian upbringing and a Christian underpinning, that was the underpinning of our spirituality. But my dad was always quick to point out that there were no isms and osms. And so I probably have spent just as many holiday seasons with Jewish friends of the family as I have with Christian friends of the family. It was something, and now that I look back at it, it was intentional. I didn't realize it at the time what my dad was doing through kind of immersion and making sure that everyone came together. It helped us with that common cause and not getting caught up in the foolishness of divide and conquer and just the detriment of stereotypes and making blanket statements. And so Dick Gregory always, you can look with all of the recordings, everything there, you can look and see, and not just in what he said, because it's a mistake. As a black man, I know when people say, oh, well, I have black friends. That doesn't cut it. It's, what are you doing? What are your actions? Because, part of what we were talking about recently in another project was about lynching. And we pointed out the folks who stayed in their home and closed their blinds and buried their heads in the sand, and they were just as culpable as the folks who were out there actively doing it. You have to be part of good, you have to be involved, and you have to stand up and you have to say something. So for his lifetime, he spoke for all of humanity, and for his lifetime, he had a marvelous relationship with the Jewish community, and many of his, business partners were Jewish, and not this, dangerous, stereotypical, my dad has had a lot of money taken from him, but from everybody. It was just because he was a young man that didn't have much business knowledge back in the 60s, and a lot of that was corrected with time, and he learned those lessons, and a lot of those lessons he was passing on to the other, younger entertainers, and never once was it rooted, in any hate. It just was, you can say things, but more than saying it, it's how you live your life and through actions. And you can look over Dick Gregory's body of work, and it was always about inclusiveness, so much so that, he went the next mile into environment, to the point, perfect transition to your other question. Here we grew up in Plymouth, Massachusetts. This time my dad was incredibly wealthy, so you had this family of 10 black children, all with big kind of Jackson 5 afros, being driven down the road in 2 back-to-back brand new Silver Shadow Rolls Royces that would pull over on the side of the highway, and all 10 of us would get out and pick up trash. So you can imagine the scene on the side of a highway, 2 Rolls Royces, 10 black children, big afros, picking up trash. And so I think we caused more wrecks than we did good, of folks just rubbernecking and saying, what in the world is going on? What is this? Like, we drive all the cheese. That doesn't make sense. And when something doesn't make sense, you pause for a moment. That's dangerous. So he was all in when it came. So all of those, don't be a litter bug and all those things. You drove down the road, people would throw whole bags of food out back then. Kids today would be horrified to see how their elders had been behaving. So for my dad, as I mentioned, the dirty coal burning story in his youth, being an environmentalist just was profoundly important. I get asked this question all the time. Civil rights movement would have happened with or without Dick Gregory. The entertainment obviously would have happened with or without Dick Gregory. Dick Gregory making it cool to be a vegan, making it cool to be an environmentalist, making it cool to care about global issues that didn't necessarily concern you, is something that I think 100 years from now will have more impact than all of the other things that his current notoriety is for. So 2 great questions, so thank you. Yes, sir. 1 minute, good.
Yeah, well, if I could try to sneak
Yes,
in a
no, go
couple.
right ahead.
First, did it ever bother your dad that, more comedians didn't sort of use their talents in the way he did for activism, or was he more like, everybody can just make that decision for themselves? And a little bit related, are there particular comedians that were contemporaries of his, or came after, or even influences that kind of were at the top of his list?
Again, great question. So to answer the first one first, he never regretted it. I mean, he never expected any. He looked back on it and thought it was kind of crazy what he did, quite honestly. And so he never thought others should. He was happy when folks would. And now here we are, 2022. You can straddle the fence as an entertainer. You can still keep your income and then go and be an activist, because most of them are doing it with their thumbs. So he didn't have that opportunity. For him, once he was all in, he was blackballed. The comedy clubs, they wouldn't have him anymore. So a lot of people think, oh, Dick Gregory walked away from entertainment. He was really blackballed from being an entertainer because of his activism. So it never bothered him. Sometimes in moments of deep reflection, he would think, and it was always, just a couple minutes, hey, wow, Doc, and he called me Doc long before I was a chiropractor. Hey, Doc, if I had just, if I had stayed the course and stayed in, I'd be one of the wealthiest human beings, and we'd be on a jet right now going to get pudding with the Queen. And he would go through a whole thing, and then he would just snap out of it and say, what a horrible life that would be. And then let's get back to work. So did he ever think about it? Did he fully comprehend what he walked away from? Absolutely. Did he regret it or wish he could do it differently? Absolutely not. And as far as my dad returned to comedy in the end, my dad was speaking at high schools a lot. We started getting letters from schools that conversation vocabulary was way too colorful. So we said, okay, if we can no longer have him speaking at schools and colleges, we might as well get him back into comedy. And so no one tells Dick Gregory what to do. We gently encourage and allow those opportunities to kind of rise to the top. He got back into comedy and was loving it. I'm referencing this because he got a chance to work with a lot of young comedians. And he would look at the crowd. He would look how the crowd was responding to him. And that's how he would say, that one's got it, that one doesn't. And so, but he just loved laughter. He loved laughter. And, up into his final breaths, we were laughing, probably inappropriately so. So very good. Folks, I know I've ran over my time here. Sorry about that, but I am a Gregory. Thank you all. Thank you so much for coming out. I truly appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Gregory.